Hey everybody, welcome to Performance Anxiety. This week is a very special show. It's our 50th, and we have a special guest with us. Bruce Pavitt, the founder of Sub Pop Records, joins us. He talks about the early days of Sub Pop, going from compilations to the Singles Club to the joint release of Nirvana's Nevermind album with Geffen Records. There's also possibly some unreleased Kurt Cobain recordings out there that Bruce tells us about. Then there's a time he went on tour with Nirvana and Tad in Europe, 1989. There's some great stories there. Check out his website, brucepavitt.com, where you can buy his books. Check him out on social media to see what he's up to. He's also a DJ. It's Bruce Pavitt on Instagram and Twitter, and brucepavitt.com. Check us out on social media at PerformanceANX on Twitter and Instagram. And don't forget to check out our merchandise at performanceanx.threadless.com. Please enjoy our 50th show with Sub Pop founder Bruce Pavitt.
This is Bruce Pavitt of Sub Pop Records, and you're listening to Performance Anxiety.
Good time. I was just about to call you. Thank you so much for doing this. I really do appreciate it, man.
100%. Thank you for your interest.
Sub Pop was, to me, it was pretty much everything in the really late 80s, really early 90s for me. It was graduating high school, going to college, and that was my soundtrack, man. Everything that was coming out on the label, it was amazing.
Sweet, I appreciate that. Can I ask where you grew up?
Oh, yeah, I grew up actually in New Jersey.
Where you were at that? Okay.
Yeah, and I went to school up in Rochester, New York at RIT, majored in photography, so... the artwork that you guys did was a huge influence on what I wanted to do at school. Not really able to accomplish it, unfortunately, because I'm not doing photography anymore. But the layouts, the Charles Peterson's work, everything combined was just a huge influence on me.
Well, thank you so much. I was the art director there at that time, and I have to say that when I came across some 3-foot by 4-foot Charles Peterson images, and he was creating those through University of Washington on their printer. As soon as I saw those images, I knew that Sub Pop could really start focusing on Seattle bands because we had a look. Up until that point, I had been releasing mixtapes of demos from around the country. I had released a compilation called Sub Pop 100, which again was bands from around the country. But as soon as I saw Charles's images, I'm like, oh my God, if we attach these to Green River and Soundgarden, that's something. So it was a real epiphany.
I've seen, and going to school for it, I got to see a lot of the photographers, the great images, but to see, real bands and all the motion and energy in those photos, it was revelatory for me. Like, I don't have to do these amazing setup photographs. I don't have to do everything in a studio. The concert photographs aren't always the Rolling Stones ones or the Led Zeppelins you see. It's bands like Nirvana and Soundgarden who are just so into it and so energetic that you can do something besides besides all this setup work that I was seeing.
Absolutely. And I think one of the some of the factors that really engaged people were the fact that these shows were in small clubs. Okay, so they're very intimate. You talk about Rolling Stones, etc., and classic live concert photos would emphasize how big the crowd was, and how important the band was, because there's 30,000 people. We did the exact opposite. It's like there's only 100 people in the room, and the photographer is getting put on the stage right as he's clicking the camera. Yep. And what Charles did very consciously is he tried to capture the interaction between the band and the fans. So typically his photos would include music fans. And so my theory is kids in Washington, D.C. are picking up these records like Superfuzz Big Muff by Mudhoney or their second album, and they're picturing themselves at these clubs in this scene, And lo and behold, we had caravans of young hipsters come to Seattle, and it changed the city forever. And I think Charles Peterson's images, along with the music, really helped to attract people to Seattle.
Oh yeah, I mean, it attracted a lot of attention. It got me there because that's one of the first things the first Charles Peterson album I can actually remember seeing is actually Soundgarden's Louder Than Love. And then going backwards from there, I mean, I got that when that first came out. A friend of mine I don't know if he had Ultra Mega OK or had just gotten Louder Than Love, and I heard it, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I got to get these guys. And then so I started working my way backwards and then finding them on Sub Pop, and then finding Mudhoney, and then finding Green River, and it was just, and then finding what was on the roster at that point.
Awesome. Little anecdote here. A&M Records actually flew me down to LA to give them some advice about the cover art.
Oh, really?
And my advice is you got to keep it real simple. That's the whole deal. You know, you get a great live Charles Peterson shot of Chris Cornell on there, and don't get too complicated. It's all about the impact, the emotional impact of that photo. And so I was essentially the art director for that record, for the front, not the back.
Right.
I'm just curious. I'm sorry. Where are you based? Where are you talking from right now?
Oh, right now I'm actually about 75 miles due west of DC. I'm in Winchester, Virginia.
Oh, okay, cool. I'm just trying to get some context here.
Oh yeah, the home of Patsy Cline.
Cool. Well, I did. I'm just going to jump in here for a second. We were talking about photos and images and so forth.
Yeah.
I just wanted to share some information that's relatively new. About 6 years ago, I published a book called Experiencing Nirvana, which was essentially a collection of photos of Nirvana, Mudhoney, and Tad as they were touring Europe back in 1989, and they were playing to crowds of 100 to 200. And all three groups wound up meeting in London for a Sub Pop showcase in December of '89, and that really helped with the momentum of what was going on with Sub Pop and Nirvana in particular. And so this book has some anecdotes, but it's also got a lot of real intimate photos. And just recently, I've set up an art show that's going up in a couple of weeks right outside of Fort Lauderdale, Florida. So if any of your listeners are anywhere near Fort Lauderdale, they should go to the Pompano Beach Cultural Center. I've got a lot of rare Cobain and Nirvana photos up in that, and I'll be doing a lecture, a multimedia lecture on September 21st. Oh, wow. I'll also be doing a lecture up in Utica, New York. Am I pronouncing that correctly? You're probably familiar.
Where was it again?
So the Utica, Utica,
Utica,
New York. Utica. Yes. So I'll be doing a lecture there on November 1st. So I just signed that contract 2 days ago. So just sharing some information, and these talks will be focusing on a lot of these rare photos and what it was like in the grassroots period of helping to build that scene.
That is fantastic.
I'm just going to throw one more thing out there. I really appreciate that. I'm working with a company in Detroit called 1X Run, who does limited edition prints. So anybody interested in getting a hold of some of these images, very soon, this summer, probably in the next 30 to 60 days, we'll be releasing a series of these images on the website 1X Run out of Detroit. So this is all just come into focus in the past week or so. So that's some fresh information. Oh,
man, that's fantastic. Breaking news here on Performance Anxiety.
There you go.
Well, thank you, man. I appreciate it. That's fantastic. I love the photography. I've seen so much work from a lot of different people in that time frame, and it's all just, it's amazing looking back on it now how young everybody was.
Oh yeah, yep, absolutely. I think Cobain was 21 when we started working with him.
Oh my gosh! So you started off in Olympia, though. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, and so Sub Pop.
That is correct, yeah.
So Sub Pop was more like a fanzine, and so the first 4 editions didn't have any cassettes or any music accompaniment. Was it just reviews, or was it commentary, or what was it like? 'Cause I've never had the chance to see the first few editions.
Well, I will mention that I did publish all those zines in a book called Sub Pop USA, so fans can go straight to Amazon and order that. What I did was pretty unusual at the time. Starting in 1980, I started reviewing a lot of rare, obscure indie records from around the country, a lot of records that were really being ignored. And then I would provide mailing addresses for those records so that people could get a hold of them.
Oh, cool.
And I organized the records regionally so people could flip through and go, oh, Washington, D.C., what's going on there? Oh, Bad Brain single, that kind of thing. Oh, Minor Threat. And so just by organizing the record reviews regionally, people started to get a feel for the flavors of the different underground scenes. And of course, this is all pre-internet.
That's sounds like it at the time, especially, was groundbreaking. I don't remember ever seeing anything like that.
It was pretty groundbreaking. Typically, if you went to a big store in Chicago, let's say Waxtrax Records, which is one of the premier indie stores in the country, you could pick up New York Rocker, you could pick up Slash from LA, and you could read about what was going on in New York or LA or San Francisco. Maybe you pick up a fanzine from Chicago, but you wouldn't be able to find out anything about Seattle, for example. You wouldn't be able to find out anything about Detroit. So I realized there was a huge gap in this information. So I was really motivated to share information about local scenes, and that's always kind of been my interest.
So when you were growing up, to just backtrack a little bit more, was your house a musical house? Did you guys have a lot of music going through? Is that what piqued your interest in music and doing a zine like that? Well,
I will say that as a young kid, I bought a transistor radio and listened to it all the time. That was what I would do. I would get on my bike and listen to Top 40 radio, which at the time, I was born in 1959. Top 40 radio back then was actually pretty good. You know, you'd hear the Beatles and James Brown and Motown. There's a lot of stuff. And I became really obsessed with music when I was 9 years old. this is a true story. I'm 9 years old. I sold Christmas cards door to door in the summer. Now imagine trying to do that. I think a lot of people see on me. And I made $40, and I went and I bought a record player with that $40. And after that, I pretty much spent all my money on records from the age of 9. So I've been kind of a music obsessive for quite a while.
Oh my gosh, that was basically my story, but I was a little bit later. I was in college, and every single dollar I earned went to a lot of Sub Pop stuff, to be honest with you. So,
cool.
All right, so
I really appreciate that. Thanks for helping us keep the lights on.
Yeah, well, the little bit that I contributed, man, I was happy to do it. So, what made you take the leap on Sub Pop 5 to include a cassette?
Well, I had heard literally a cassette magazine from Australia, and it was called Fast Forward. It was very interesting. It would have music, but it also have interviews. I thought, wow, cassettes are really getting some traction. The Walkman had just come out, and it was obvious that you could share music with people on cassette, and you could print up as few as 10 or 100 or a few hundred, unlike records in which the smallest run was typically 500. So I immediately grasped that you could distribute music without a lot of cash, which I did not have.
Right.
And it was just kind of and I thought cassettes, I'll do a cassette version. And I alternated between the cassette zine and the printed zine for a while. Went up to like issue number 9. I did 3 cassettes, and the cassettes did well. The first one, I sold like 2,000 copies, which back in the day was huge. And the bands who forwarded me their demos were stoked because they started getting fan mail from all over the world.
Oh, cool.
And it worked. it worked. And I was just a very poor college student with a tape recorder in my living room, busting out these tapes, and it worked. So it's about as DIY as you can get.
Yeah, very punk. Sub Pop 5.
Very punk.
Sub Pop 5 included a song by you called Debbie.
That is correct.
Debbie was schizophrenic.
Now, were you involved in bands?
I was involved in bands. I was the 1980, that era was, 79, 80, 81 was kind of a quote unquote post-punk era. So there was more experimental stuff coming out. And I was in a local group called Tiny Holes that was influenced by the pop group. And in fact, K Records just released an album of ours a month ago.
Oh, wow.
And as a 21-year-old bored college student, I was making weird music that a handful of people appreciated. And that's kind of what the scene was like back then. It was just a network of hobbyists and inspired amateurs putting out crazy stuff, and occasionally some of it would be interesting or entertaining.
So the first couple zines with the cassettes, were you advertising for bands to send you stuff to put out on this, or were you just kind of picking songs that you liked? Or what was the criteria for getting onto there? Was anybody rejected?
Well, I do have a story. Basically, I would approach certain bands. I was getting records in the mail, and if I was inspired by a certain group, I would make a request, and that seemed to work. I only rejected one tape. That's a long story. I can't really go into that right now, but it's essentially I was suggesting the group send in their stuff. And what I was really proud of, probably more than anything, is I contacted an illustrator named Charles Burns, who went on to become very well known in the graphic community. And he had also gone to Evergreen State College in Olympia, which is the school that I went to.
Okay.
And his illustrations were excellent. And if you Google Sub Pop 5, you'll see what I'm talking about. He was super talented. He went on to do cover art for Iggy Pop, and he even did a cover for Time magazine and so forth. So he's become kind of a legend, and I got him involved super early. So my tapes looked really good because of his talent.
There's a turning point here when you get to Sub Pop 100, Sub Pop 200. After you start actually releasing EPs and singles by bands, the Singles Club starts to come around. How did you go from just doing compilations to having bands record songs specifically for you?
Sure. Well, the first album was a compilation, and that was kind of an extension of the cassettes. And I thought, well, let's get some cash together, because it was a lot more expensive to do that. And that album sold 5,000 copies, which again at that time was really, really good. So I knew I had kind of developed this brand, Sub Pop. I did the zines, I did the record, and kind of as I stated, Charles Peterson's photos were very inspiring, but also there was a local compilation called Deep Six that really kind of gave focus to this grungy new sound that was happening in Seattle. So I started focusing on that. I was a huge Green River fan and went to all their shows. Soundgarden, I went to their shows. I actually grew up with the guitarist Kim Thile in Illinois, so I had been friends with him for ages. So things just kind of naturally came together. Again, funds were always hard to come by. I borrowed some money from my dad to put out the Green River record. And then I met John Poneman, who became my business partner, and he scraped together some funds, and we got Soundgarden going, and we opened up an office in April of 1988. with just 3 records in our catalog there.
Wow.
And it was very self-going. Singles were cheaper to put out, so that's one of the reasons we were pumping out a lot of singles. Okay. Touch Me, I'm Sick by Mudhoney came out that summer, did well. And then that fall we released Love Buzz by Nirvana. And we really started to get some traction as people became more and more engaged with the records, which were produced by Jack and Dino. A lot of fans know that.
Oh yeah.
So awesome. The records had a look and a sound, and I think we really kind of helped put Seattle on the map there.
Oh, absolutely, musically for sure, but the look. Sub Pop definitely had its own look, and it was, you pulled something out, you knew it was a Sub Pop release. Was that something that you based on, like Motown or one of the other record labels that would have a very specific style?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes, in particular, I was influenced by a jazz label called Blue Note that had a very specific style.
Yeah, I know.
Every time you'd pick up a Blue Note, you go, oh, wow, here's a vibe. There's a photo. It's usually tinted, and the logo is on the front of the cover. So we kind of referenced Blue Note. Also, Factory Records in the UK had a very distinctive look and a very distinctive sound. So we were definitely drawing on those kind of references. We wanted to build a brand, and we wanted people to pick up a record and instantly know it's a Sub Pop record. So that was a very conscious decision on our part, for sure.
And you guys also had a great sense of humor and a great sense of irony in a lot of the marketing and publicity that you did. The shirts that said "loser" on it, the singles club. I remember it started off with "Hey, loser," and telling you a little bit about the club. And it's not the Alanis Morissette kind of irony. I mean, it's actual real irony. I read
and we tried to straddle that. Punk rock at that time, and a lot of these bands were rooted in punk sensibility, and of course all of them had seen Black Flag live, but they had other influences as well. But a lot of punk rock at that time had become a little too serious, frankly, and the musicians I was working with had more of a sense of humor, and they were really more about kind of like doing shows for a cathartic release, and humor was a huge part of that. So Mark Arm, super funny guy. Tad was funny. Kurt Cobain was funny. A lot of these musicians really shared a sense of humor, so they did not take themselves too seriously. And I think what we did at Sub Pop was like, okay, let's take some corporate lingo and work it in a way that can sell music that's essentially punk rock. And at its core, this will distinguish us from everybody else. And when you're trying to build you could say build a brand or what have you, when you're trying to get people's attention, you need to try and do something different. And a lot of the culture I saw was pretty formulaic. Bands had to sound a certain way or look a certain way. And we kind of shifted gears a little bit.
Yeah, and I read a quote from Chris Cornell recently in doing research for this interview, and he said, "I remember running into Bruce around 1988, and I mentioned how there just suddenly seemed to be so much talent in Seattle. And he put his arm around me and had this funny, confident look in his eyes. He said, 'Seattle's going to take over the world.' He was being tongue-in-cheek, but not really. He seemed serious about it."
Yeah, I remember that. Well, the thing is, by 87, 88, it really did seem like Seattle was onto something. And my feeling at that time was, my serious feeling at that time was that Seattle, what was going on in Seattle could be the equivalent of, let's say, what happened in Detroit in the late 60s, early 70s with like the Stooges and MC5. Mm-hmm. Not necessarily sell a lot of records, but create records that would really have an impact and would become more legendary. And that was really my intuition. I really had absolutely no idea that these bands would start selling tens of millions of records. That was completely beyond my frame of mind. I was,
Yeah, I think it's beyond everybody's at that time,
I think, you sell 50 to 100,000 records. That's knocking it out of the park. So it just got bigger and crazier and crazier and crazier as things evolved with the movies and documentaries and just everything and runway shows. And it grew into kind of a hilarious situation. And frankly, we thought it was crazy and kind of funny, because we kept saying it was going to blow up, and then it blew up beyond our expectations. So we were actually just cracking up the whole time.
And with the original Singles Club and the first singles that you guys were releasing, now the bands weren't really on a contract, if I read everything correctly. Nirvana was the first band to actually want a contract.
That is correct. That is correct. And back then, yeah.
I was going to say, so how did that work with the band? Did they just come in and record, and then you released it and you split profits? I mean, how did that whole thing work?
Yeah, typically the way the indie culture worked at that time, and I think Factory Records was kind of instrumental in setting this tone, which is the label basically pays for stuff. And then once the record breaks even, anything after that is split between the artist and the label. Okay. And those were always done on handshake deals. And it was very, very common to do business that way. And a couple things we did learn, some major labels came around and they were interested. And we were like, yeah, well, we'll consider this. And when they found out that none of our bands are on contract, they're like, well, there's no way we can do business with you without that. So we were kind of in transition, and Nirvana did approach us and ask for a contract. And there's a little drama there. I'll let people Google it. I won't go into it too much, but we came up with a contract that was essentially Xerox from a book out of a library. And Poneman copied the contract, used a little whiteout because we literally didn't have the money to hire an attorney, right? Wow. That would have been too expensive. And I remember the band was in the office and they're signing the contract. And I just had, you just have this moment like, I don't know, this could be a significant moment, this could be significant. And it was one of those gut feelings like, this might be a big deal. And it was. It basically saved the company. Without that contract, Sub Pop absolutely would not have stayed in business.
And that's what led to the inclusion of Sub Pop on Nevermind, on the Nevermind release.
Yes. We had the band on contract, so the Sub Pop logo is on the back of Nevermind, and rightfully so. We introduced them to the producer Butch Vig. We introduced them to the photographer Michael Levine, who took the cover photo. And we were a very well-connected machine. We just didn't have very much cash, but we knew who the creatives were. We knew who the most talented people were. And that's how you exist as an indie. You see the talent, and hopefully that talent isn't charging a whole lot of money. Yeah. And we had points on several Nirvana records. A lot of cash came in. We sold a couple million Bleach records. So that really did change the game. But I will tell you, literally 2 weeks before Smells Like Teen Spirit came out, it came out in mid-September of 1991.
Yeah.
I'll tell you an anecdote. There was an infamous convention called the Independent Pop Underground.
Okay.
In Olympia. And Fugazi played there. L7 came up. There were a lot of really cool bands from around the country that came to Olympia and kind of had an anti-convention, essentially.
Okay.
This was literally 2 weeks before Teen Spirit came out. And I realized that Sub Pop had less than $100 in the bank.
Oh, wow.
And I know this because I was trying to get paid $100, and I had to go to my own ATM, which didn't have much more than that, and pay this guy off at the convention. It was literally, I was draining my personal account to pay the last tiny bill. Well, it wasn't the last bill, that's for sure. Yeah. So 2 weeks later, Smells Like Teen Spirit comes out, and a few weeks after that, Nevermind comes out, and by Christmas, this is 3 months later, I remember being in Chicago and realizing that we were going to get a check for $500,000.
God.
Just on royalty. And, a month later, I realized, actually, we're going to get a check for $1 million, and so
wow. That's
all from going from literally nothing to that huge success. So trust me, it was pretty mind blowing.
That's amazing. But before that happened, there was a really interesting collaboration which has just come out recently. The past, well, I guess now it's almost 10 years. The Jury sessions with Lanigan and Cobain and Mark Pickrell and Chris Novoselic, I believe, right?
Right.
And one of those songs.
I'll be totally honest with you. I'm not really familiar with that.
Okay.
It sounds like it sure should be, but as I mentioned earlier, I live on a remote island. I try to keep pace with stuff. And in general, I'd say I have been keeping pace with stuff, but I'm actually not familiar with that. So thanks for bringing that to my attention.
Oh, man. Well, it was now one of those songs. That was the sessions where they did all the Lead Belly songs. And I guess my big question.
Oh, wait. I'm sorry. Are you talking about a recording that happened like in 1990?
Yes. The ones that the infamous. I believe they called themselves the Jury at that point.
Well, no. So, okay, I know what you're talking about. Okay, in 1990, we released a solo album by Mark Lanigan, and Kurt Cobain stepped in on a cover of the Lead Belly song, as did Novoselic. Mark Pickrell, who was the drummer with the Screaming Trees, also played on it. So I don't know if potentially the Lanigan record got repackaged with another name, but I'm not familiar with it being referenced as the Jury, but I'm very familiar with that recording because Sub Pop put it out in 1990.
Right. I believe in the Nirvana, that box set that came out like 10, 12 years ago, when the Lights Out, I think at that point they said it was called the Jury.
Interesting. Okay. Well, it wasn't referred to as the Jury at that time.
Ah, okay.
So
okay.
That could have been like, but it's super cool. And that Lanigan record is called The Winding Sheet. At least it was when we released it. And I always thought it was totally amazing.
Oh, that's one of my favorite Lanigan releases ever. I love that album.
Yeah, he's super talented.
Now, the question I have about that isn't really about those sessions or anything, because I think if any fans of Mark Lanigan, Screaming Trees, and Nirvana, pretty familiar with that by getting the box set with the other 3 tracks on it. But I was wondering if there were ever any collaborations like that happened that just kind of fizzled out and nothing ever came of it. Any other, like, I guess, sub pop super groups that really nobody knows about?
No, but there is an obscure recording that I will just throw out into the internet sphere here, and that is, there was a project that Kurt Cobain played on, and there are tapes I know floating around, and he was playing with Calvin Johnson, who is a visionary of sorts and led the band Beat Happening, but he was also in a group called the Go Team. And Toby Vale, who was a drummer and is drummer for Bikini Kill, was in the group. And, of course, Kurt, the song Smells Like Teen Spirit. Anyway, he had a crush on Toby Bale at the time. So he jumped in on a couple of the Go-Team tracks. And this is back in, I think, 1990 or so. So I'm just going to mention that. And I know last time I talked to Calvin, he said, yeah, I'm actually sitting on some tapes that have never been released. I'm like, okay, that's interesting.
Wow.
So for collector types, I'm just putting that out there because I think it might be some of the last super rare Cobain-related recordings that may eventually surface.
Oh, my gosh. Yeah, I had never heard of that. That's news to me. That's now, there's one of my favorite tracks. It's a hilarious track, Soundgarden Sub Pop Rock City. And you appear on that. That is, I'm assuming that's actually you on the recording.
I just want to know what the heck's going on.
Well, I had this problem.
What the heck's going on?
Yeah, okay, well, do you think you'd have too much of trouble if we got rid of our sideburns?
At your earliest convenience.
Well, I know you said that before, but do you think Bruce and mine?
This is Bruce Pavitt.
Well, Bruce, okay, can we have our drummer back, Bruce?
Bye.
Yes, it is. That's from an answering machine, and I'm not even sure whose answering machine that was. But they were, those guys. See, like I said, the grunge guys, they really did have a sense of humor. So
now, did they tell you they wanted to do that before?
That was a good one.
Yeah, did they tell you they wanted to do that before they put the whole thing together?
Oh, no. We had no idea. They just handed us the tape, and it's just like, well, what are you going to do?
Oh man, that's hilarious. That's got to be kind of a shock to realize that you're on a Soundgarden recording.
Yeah, it's trip. It's trip. Kim was always kind of a smart ass, though. That did not surprise me at all.
All right, so I wanted to ask you some stuff about Nirvana's tour. Now, the book, you have a book that came out a little while ago about touring with them in Europe in '89, I believe you said.
Yep.
I read that quite often they were on stage destroying their instruments, and you would be the one tasked with getting repairs done or replacements. How did they do that a lot? Is that the case, that you were kind of the go-to guy?
They did do that. They did it almost all the time, and there were times when we were given the task of getting a guitar. And in this book, Experiencing Nirvana, there is an example of this where they played a show in Rome. Kurt, not only did he smash his guitar, but he really had enough with touring, and he climbed the PA and threatened to jump off. And I would say had a breakdown, like literally had a breakdown on stage. And he went backstage and said that the band was over with, it was done. And this is all documented in the book. And I know that the next day, John and I took Kurt to a guitar store, and I have a picture of them in the guitar store where John is buying Kurt a new guitar because he had just trashed his last one. And you got to realize nobody had any money at that time. The band didn't, we didn't. And so I would say it was a little excessive considering the financial circumstances.
Yeah,
but it's all there in the book.
That had to put quite a strain on you guys.
Yeah, it's not like we were always following them around and doing that, but I do have a documented case where indeed we spent some of our last cash buying him another guitar, and that's what they were doing.
There were a ton of bands in the Seattle area, and a lot of them actually weren't on Sub Pop because obviously there's competing labels and all. Was there a band, like a one that got away story that you always wanted to sign but never were able to for Sub Pop?
Well, yeah, there's a lot of stories like that. I know. Well, to make it really interesting, we had a receptionist, Chris Taquino, was like, "Oh, there's some good bands around," and he wound up signing Modest Mouse, and also, God, it's on the tip of my tongue, the band from Idaho. Geez, why can't I think of this name? Built to Spill.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Modest Mouse and Built to Spill were both signed by our receptionist who started his own label.
Wow.
And in fact, it's like, damn, that receptionist should have been doing A&R for Sub Pop. I'll tell you, there's so much going on, so much, there's so much competition. It's so crazy that it's hard to just stay on top of everything. But in particular, I thought, yeah, we got scooped not once but twice by our receptionist.
Oh,
so,
well, I can only imagine the atmosphere there. You're looking at that time of the early '90s, Sub Pop's, starting to explode, and Seattle is literally the center of the music world. So I can only imagine what your office was like.
Yep. No, it was insane. And there were international travelers coming in. We actually opened up a store across the street just so we could deal with all the tourists. And there was a time in the early 90s where literally every day, every single day, John and I were doing interviews. I remember one day a Spanish television crew showed up, and I'm like, yep, that's just another day in the office. And that just became normal.
Oh, man. Now, I threw out to some of on the social media a little bit that I'd be talking with you tonight, and I asked if anybody had any questions. And a couple of them came up, and, a lot of the typical ones, what did it feel like working with some of these guys, but at the time, you may have had the feeling, but they weren't as big as they would eventually become. But there was a question. Somebody wanted to know if there's any recordings from your days in Olympia by bands like Mr. Brown or Tiny Holes that might be available that never really got the exposure they deserved.
Well, that's it. It's interesting you should mention that. Mr. Brown, by the way, was an indie label in Olympia.
Oh, okay.
Which put out cool stuff, particularly by an artist, Steve Fisk, who went on to record some Nirvana stuff for us. He recorded a track called Been a Sun, for example, and Stain. He's a very creative producer, and he was actually in my band, Tiny Holes, and that record called City Under Siege. That album literally came out a month ago on K Records, and that it was just a live recording.
I'm in a box. First floor, going up. Second floor, going up. Third floor, going up.
It's something I did when I was 21, so I'm not really knocking on people's doors and convincing them to buy this record. But it does exist. It exists, and you can hear me, expressing myself as a very creative 21-year-old. So we'll just leave it at that.
Yeah. Well, in my early 20s, one of the highlights of my early to mid 20s was sending a demo tape to Sub Pop and getting rejected. So I want to thank you guys for that.
So I hope you framed that letter.
Yes, my buddy has it. I got to get a copy of it, but he definitely has it framed. We had me on guitar, and I'd never taken a lesson, him on bass, and we had a drums with no cymbals and no singer, and none of us had ever taken a lesson.
Very good.
We were like,
that sounds like
we were like the Thrown Ups, but without the talent.
That's funny. The Thrown Ups were definitely a classic.
I still have that vinyl too. That's one to listen to for sure.
Wow. Okay. Interesting. Those were the trippiest shows in the scene by far. Those Thrown Up shows.
Oh,
and listening to those tracks, you get a feel for how irreverent this scene was and how people were just having fun. And then Soundgarden got signed to A&M, and people were like, "Oh my God, somebody actually got signed!" Jeez. So what's happening?
That's it.
But hey, Mark, I think it's time for dinner here. So I'm good for another question or two, and then I'm gonna thank you and fade out.
Yes, sir. The one thing that I do ask, I have one question, and it's kind of a weird question. So if you're not. It came from one of the social media people. So if you don't want to answer it, we can edit it out. One follower on Reddit wanted to know they were friends with they have a mutual friend with you named Phil Hertz, and they were wondering. Yes. They said that the two of you had a falling out, but Phil actually passed away last August, and so they were just curious as to what that was all about, and because Phil never told them, and they weren't sure if you knew that he had passed, and so they wanted me to let you know.
Yeah, sure. Phil was the drummer in Tiny Holes. I've always considered Phil a friend. I've never thought of us as having a falling out. Certainly he moved to Chicago, so we didn't see each other that much, but I talked to Phil about a year ago. I did not realize he was basically dealing with brain cancer, and he did not mention this at the time. I am aware that he passed, and it's a sad moment. Phil was an awesome guy, a huge music fan, and was deeply involved with creating music and working for music distributors. Just an awesome guy, and it's sad that he's left us.
All right. Well, I really do want to thank you for coming on and spending so much time. I know we've gone over what we originally planned to spend on this, so I thank you so much. It really means a lot.
Well, thanks so much, my friend. I really appreciate it.